This story is called 13th and Elm, written on January 20th, 2016. I always get a little uncomfortable when the topic of the paranormal comes up, particularly when some people seem to be so adamant that ghosts simply can't exist. I don't attempt to convince them otherwise. As a matter of fact, I don't share my experiences with them at all. This is actually the first time I've attempted to chronicle everything my family went through. It was only for a brief window of time, just a few months, but it burned a scar into my consciousness that'll never go away. I remember my mother and father being so excited at the prospect of all of us moving into our first home. They'd been raising 4 young children in an apartment. Just the idea of a family having our own bedrooms and more than one bathroom had us all elated. When we first glimpsed at the house in the corner of 13th and Elm, my siblings and I almost couldn't believe it. The place seemed enormous. It was an old colonial-style house with wide-open rooms on the first floor and all of the bedrooms on the second floor, connected by a grand old wooden staircase. My brother and sisters and I raced through the place, exploring each room with a sense of excitement and wonder. It was my brother Tommy who first noticed the door in the corner of the kitchen that led to the basement. He swung it open and he and I stood at the top of the stairs, peering down for a few moments. We carefully descended down into the basement, unsure of what we would find. Once we got to the bottom of the stairs, we were a little disappointed with how benign it seemed to be. It was a bare room with a concrete floor, a utility sink in one corner, and a single window that could have been peering out into the garden at the front yard. We gazed around at this rather buoyant space for a minute before Tommy noticed it. Hey, was but the floor over there? He pointed to a patch in the concrete about 4 feet long and 3 feet wide. There was a different colour and texture from the rest of the concrete. It was obviously been torn up at some point and patched up. I didn't think much of it until Tommy spoke up. "You know the lady that left here died, right?" I didn't know that. I recall the mum and dad mentioning something briefly about the family that owned the house happened to move out in a hurry. The circumstances behind it were never discussed as far as I can remember. Tommy continued, "Yeah, she died in a really bad car accident. Dad said so." "So?" I carried, for a little uneasy. "Well, I bet that's where they buried her, right there," Tommy said, pointing to the odd patch in the concrete. For some reason, this ridiculous theory seemed to make sense in our child's minds. I distinctly remember, right at that moment, the atmosphere in the room changed. The air felt electric. I could feel all the hairs in my arms stand up. I was suddenly claustrophobic and felt a wave of panic and unease wash over me. I didn't even respond to Tommy. I dashed up the stairs as fast as I could. Tommy was right in my heels, chuckling at how easy it was to freak out his little brother. Once I was back in the kitchen with a storm of activity going on, the feeling passed instantly, like flipping a light switch off. The next few days were a blur of unpacking and getting settled. Tommy got his own room at the top of the stairs and I got the one next to him. Our older sisters, Cheryl and Cindy, shared the middle bedroom across the hall. My dad was a long-haul trucker who would be gone for days, sometimes a week at a time, so we'd barely gone moved into the house when he reluctantly had to go on the road for a few days. The first inkling that something wasn't quite right with the house happened the next morning after he had left. My siblings and I were walking out the front door to get on the bus to school, and we noticed a cigarette butt lying on the wooden front porch. Not exactly strange, but we knew it wasn't there before. We'd cleaned the house top to bottom after moving in, including the porch. A rather obvious cigarette butt lying directly in front of the door would have been noticed, but there it was. It kind of caught each other's glances as we looked at it. We shrugged and got on the school bus, and we went on with our day. A few days later, my brother Tommy and I were playing outside in the yard when we noticed a second cigarette butt, this time on the lawn, directly under Cindy and Cheryl's bedroom window. Once again, Tommy was there with a brilliant theory to scare the pants off me. I bet it's a family that used to live here. They keep coming back and hanging around outside because they know the mum's buried in the basement. The mention of the grave in the basement made my eyes wander off to the single window in the basement that was barely visible at ground level. It was at that moment that I was certain someone was looking back at me through the window. Tommy read the expression on my face and followed my gaze to the window. "We should go check it out down there," he said. I reluctantly followed him. As uncomfortable as it was going down there, I was more sensitive to looking like a wuss in front of my older brother. As we got to the door to the basement, even Tommy paused. "We should take the Patches with us," he said, referring to our family mutton. Patches will protect us. Patches was an easygoing and agreeable fellow. I guess he would have to be with 4 rambunctious children constantly terrorising him. We found him dozing next to the couch in the living room. Tommy grabbed him by the collar and led him over to the basement door. When Tommy swung the door open, Patches immediately resisted. He plopped his butt down on the kitchen floor and refused to move an inch. Tommy yanked on his collar, but Patches pulled back. Eventually Tommy decided just to pick the dog up and carry him down the stairs, with Patches struggling mightily the whole way. Halfway down the stairs, Patches went berserk. He yelled and growled and snapped his teeth at Tommy, who let go of him in surprise. Patches raced up the stairs and scampered under the couch. Without the dog's protection, Tommy and I abandoned our mission. That night, we were all around the kitchen table having dinner. Patches had been in a sour mood ever since then, sitting on the basement stairs, and we were eating dinner. Patches rested on the kitchen floor, his eyes never leaving the basement door. His ears were perked up and his attention was focused on that door. At one point, his hackles raised and he rose to his feet, snarling and growling at the door. We all stopped our dinner chat and turned to look at the dog. Patches was in full-on protecting mode. He was snarling like someone was coming up the stairs. This lasted for a moment before he calmed down and he went back to lying down on the kitchen floor. It was maybe a night or two later when I first heard the footsteps. I was lying in bed in the middle of the night when I distinctly heard footsteps coming from the basement steps. They were heavy, very deliberate steps, slow and steady, and thump, thump, thump. I strained my ears as much as I could in the darkness. When the steps reached the top of the basement stairs, there was a pause. I didn't hear the basement door open, but the steps then started through the kitchen. Thump, thump, thump. When they reached the bottom of the staircase again, there was a pause. Then just as slowly and deliberately, the footsteps started up the stairs. By this point, I was wild-eyed in terror, but I honestly couldn't think of what to do next. I was frozen in place in my bed, pulled the covers up to my chin. The 3 steps reached the top of the staircase, and at the end of the hallway leading to our bedrooms. Again a pause, then the London steps started down the hallway. They slowly advanced past Tommy's room. Thump, thump, thump. God's forgive me, but I prayed that it just continued down the hall towards my mother's room, but it didn't. The steps stopped right outside my bedroom door. It was a long, painfully drawn-out moment when everything seemed to stop. I wasn't breathing, I wasn't moving. The pulse was absolutely thundering in my ears, and every nerve in my body was howling. After what seemed like an eternity, then the next noise jangled my senses. It was a tapping noise, almost maddeningly quiet at first. Something was tapping on the bedroom door about once every 3 seconds or so. I just strained to listen to it. I felt that it sounded rather retarded, terribly for key. It sounded like someone was tapping a key on the bedroom door. Tap, tap, tap. Just as I was beginning to think of an escape route, perhaps go out the bedroom window, suddenly it stopped. My eyes must have been the size of hubcaps as I stared at that door. I figured whatever was on the other side of the door would turn the doorknob. Seconds went by. The air was thick and suffocating, and I was plotting my route to the bedroom window should the door fly open. However, I was taken by surprise with the next sound. The 3 steps started again, but they started from the bottom of the basement steps. Thump, thump, thump. What the hell? What on earth did this? How on earth did this thing get back down to the basement steps without me here? It was at this point that I had enough. I jumped out of my bed, threw open my door, and I raced to my mother's bedroom. When I entered the room and flicked on the light, I saw that she was sitting up in bed, completely awake and aware, her eyes wide and panicked. She'd heard it too, and when she saw me, she immediately tried to downplay the situation. She smoothed my hair and rubbed it back and tried to convince me I'd had a nightmare, but I knew better. I could see in her eyes that she was just as unnerved at that as I was. It was then that I realised that whatever in this house was terrifying my mother as much as it was terrifying me, and that made my blood run cold. My dad came home from his road trip, and for a few days things returned to normal. My mother and I exchanged nervous glances across the table as we had dinner with my father. He was completely oblivious to the situation, and we obviously didn't know how to bring that up with him. How do you tell a burly trucker that you heard a ghost coming up the basement steps? Eventually, he had to go out on the road again. I could sense the tension in my mother as she helped him pack up for his next road trip. She tried to play off with us kids, but I knew better. I was dreading what was coming next as much as she was. The first night home without my father seemed uneventful. I was uneasy and slept fitfully the whole night, but nothing of importance happened, not at least for me. The next morning at the breakfast table, I noticed my sister Cheryl seemed to be a little unkempt. She was normally annoyingly bubbly and vibrant in the morning, but this morning she seemed a little dishevelled. Eventually she turned to my mother. "Thanks for closing our window last night, Mum. The rain would have ruined everything." I watched her blink for a moment while holding the coffee pot. "What are you talking about, Phil?" Cheryl seemed a little confused. "Mum, you came into my room last night and shut my window, remember?" My mother was now more than a little disturbed. "No, Cheryl, I didn't come into your room. What do you mean?" Cheryl was now frustrated. She started using that tone that preteen kiddos use when condescending to their mothers. "Mom, I woke up last night because it was thundering and raining outside. You were standing next to my window and you closed it. Then you walked out. I remember because your white nightgown was flapping in the breeze coming through the window." The colour drained out of my mother's face, and the lines around her mouth suddenly became very pronounced. I'd never seen her looking so old before. "Dear, I don't have a white nightgown. You know my nightgown's red, you know that? You know that, Cheryl?" After a very uncomfortable few moments, my mother regained her composure and suddenly switched gears. "You had a dream, it was just a dream." Confused and frustrated, Cheryl was now defiant. "No, that wasn't a dream, Mum. My window was open when I went to bed, and it was closed in the morning. You closed it. Why do you remember?" My mother was flustered. Her cheeks burned red, and she stared at the kitchen table. Her head jabbed up, and she looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. "Oh, Chris, you're running late, dear. Get ready for school." A few days later, Tommy and I were raising hell outside in the yard again. We came around the corner of the house and stopped in our tracks. An old tricycle that had been out in our backyard was sitting there, directly underneath Cindy and Cheryl's bedroom window. On closer inspection, we noticed that the seat of the tricycle was bent slightly as if someone very big and heavy had been standing on top of the seat. And there were also not one but two cigarette butts lying on the ground next to the trike. Eventually Tommy stated the obvious. Was a guy standing on this to look in Cheryl's window? I didn't answer. I picked up the tricycle and whipped it as far as my little frame would allow, back into our backyard. Tommy looked at me for a second with a puzzled look on his face, but he let the moment pass and went back to playing. A couple of days passed with relatively little happening, but one morning it was Tommy who came to the breakfast table looking haggard. I questioned him about what was going on, but he waved me off. His eyes kept darting around the kitchen table as if he was looking for someone who was missing. Eventually, a mother joined us at the table and Tommy spoke up. "Mum, did Dad get back last night?" Our mother would daze for a second. No, honey, Dad didn't come home yet. Why'd you ask?" Tommy furrowed his brow and looked down into his cereal bowl for a long moment. He leveled his eyes at our mother and says, "But he came in our room last night." I was getting all too familiar with the unnerved light that swept across my mother's face. She pursed her lips for a moment before croaking, "Did you have a dream last night, Tommy?" Tommy sighed and shook his head. He seemed to be far too world-weary for a boy his age. "Mum, you know I sleep with the radio on next to our bed, right?" Our mother nodded, her head very slowly and deliberately, her eyes never leaving Tommy's. The lines around her mouth became very pronounced again. Tommy continued, "Well, last night I woke up because the radio dial was spinning up and down like someone was looking for a radio station. I sat up and looked, and Dad was standing next in our bed fiddling with the radio dial." There was a long moment of silence as my mother stared at Tommy. Her lips were pursed tight, as if she'd tasted something sour. Eventually she broke the silence. "Was that it? Was there anything else, Tommy?" Tommy looked more befuddled than ever. He gave the room another scan as if he couldn't believe that father wouldn't come home. It would come around the corner at any moment. "Well, I talked to him," Tommy said. Mum's eyebrows went up. "Oh," she said. "Did he say anything back?" "No," said Tommy. I said, "Hi, Daddy," but he didn't say anything back. He just turned around and walked out of the room, and I went back to sleep. My mother stared at Tommy for an uncomfortably long moment. This was the first time I noticed grey streaks hanging down in her brunette hair. In a moment, she suddenly snapped back to her normal self. Her face brightened and she says, "It was just that dream, baby. You're dreaming, don't worry about it." Tommy wasn't as convinced. He frowned deeply as he turned back to his cereal. The rest of us were mostly silent as we finished our breakfast and went off to school. The footsteps hadn't stopped in the meantime. The pattern would always repeat. His footsteps would lumber up the basement stairs, and then the stairwell, then stop outside my bedroom door. Mine was always my bedroom door, and then it would start tapping on the door. It would tap for a while, and then the pattern would repeat back from the bottom of the basement steps. As routine as it became, I couldn't get used to it. I was as terrified on the 10th night as I was in the first. I was convinced that whatever was tapping on the door would bust in eventually. It was almost more maddening to me that it never did. It just kept on repeating that same damn loop over and over again for how long was doing it. Was it doing it even when I wasn't at home? One afternoon I dozed off on the couch in the living room while watching my after-school cartoons. I started to groggily come to a bit when I became aware of a presence within the room with me. I kept my eyes closed tightly, but my brain snapped back to awareness as my ears went on high alert. Someone was standing at the entrance to the living room, shifting uneasily from one foot to another. I could hear the wooden floorboards squeaking underneath the person's feet. The person started slowly advancing towards me on the couch. Each floorboard squeaked distinctly as the footsteps grew closer. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the couch near my feet. Whoever this might be was now clearly standing at the end of the couch, staring at me. I sensed a presence as it started to lean over the couch, lean over me. I heard his clothes rustle slightly as it loomed over me. The face had to be inches from mine, but I never heard nor felt his breath. It was there, but it was not breathing and wasn't alive. In my panic, I started to make a high-pitched whimpering sound I couldn't control. It was at that moment that a sharp blast of cold air wafted over me, sending me up in goose pimples all over my entire body, and then nothing. The presence is gone. I knew immediately it wasn't there anymore. I leapt off that couch and out of the living room, probably without even touching the ground. I started noticing my mother growing more and more uncomfortable and restless. She didn't have to say it. I knew she was experiencing things too. At first I noticed she used to stay up later and later at night when my father wasn't at home, whether it was watching late night television or busying herself with household chores like staying up to sew patches on her clothes. It was obvious that she didn't want to go to bed. She installed glow-in-the-dark light switch covers in her bedroom and in the second floor hallway. At first it seemed like a benign safety measure until it occurred to me that those glow-in-the-dark covers actually were for her. She wanted to see the shadows moving around in the dark. They couldn't be real to her unless she saw them moving through her room. Things came to a head one night, which ended up being her last night alone in the house. My father was again going on and would chat. We were all huddled in a living room watching television with my mother. It was late, but not terribly late, maybe 10 o'clock or so. Suddenly, a very heady mood enveloped the room. We all sensed it immediately. I looked over at Tommy and Cheryl on the couch with me, and the unease was evident on their faces. Cindy was sprawled on the floor in front of us. She whipped her head around and looked at the rest of us as if to say, "Do you feel that too?" We did. My mother was in the recliner beside us. Her response was to gather up Cindy off the floor and join us on the couch. All of us huddled together. She stretched her arms around all of us. The air in the room became thick and heavy. We all kept our eyes focused on the doorway between the living room and the kitchen. It seemed whatever was causing this feeling was going to be materializing there. It was Cindy who first started to whimper and cry. She was quickly followed by the rest of us children. We were all grasping each other as tight as we could now, lovingly crying and blubbering. Eventually even my mother started to moan with tears in her eyes. Patches went on full alert. Stood in the middle of the living room floor, staring at the doorway with every muscle in his body taut. His hackles raised and he started a low rumbling in the straw. The footsteps started as they always did at the bottom of the basement steps. Thump, thump. Patches started barking in a frenzy, flashing his teeth and throwing spill. It was an answer or other. She threw open the front door and ushered us out of the house as if it was a fire drill. We ran to the neighbour's house and my mother made up some excuse for needing shelter for the night. I think she says she thought we had a gas leak or something like that. We slept fitfully on a pallet in the neighbour's living room floor. At the first sign of light the next day, we started loading up all of our earthly possessions and taking them to my grandparents' house. The house on Elm Street was the elephant in the room for my family for decades afterwards. All of us kids grew up and had families of their own, and even then, we wouldn't say much about what happened in that house. Only now that I have to document all of it here. I don't even know why, really. I guess just needed to convince myself that it was all in the past and it's all over now. So again, if you don't believe his spirits had ghosts or the paranormal or whatever, I wouldn't try to convince you. I know for a fact they're there. Those things shuffle around in the darkness. That one was called 13th and Elm.